What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, and thank you for joining me once again for this rendition of the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week recap. Folks, in this week's recap, we'll be going over several, and I mean several, 5-figure black and white era cards that came by, and we'll also be talking about what's going on with the special illustration rare Mew EX from Paldean Fates and why it's gained nearly 200% in value in about 2 months. Absolutely crazy, tons of auctions to go through, so thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And folks, after you're done enjoying this week's auction recap, please go check out the 100% Pokemon card auction block happening this Sunday, August 24th on fanaticscollect.com. There you will see, once again, even more English and Japanese graded Shining cards, more Gold Star cards, and tons of high-end PSA, CGC, and Beckett graded cards. Here is just a preview of some of the beautiful slabs up for grabs this week. Once again, no shortage of variety here, folks. So if you see something that catches your eye, go check out this lineup. A direct link to the auction block will be in the description of this video. Please support the channel, go check it out, and as always, I appreciate your support. Alright folks, let's jump into this week's auction lineup, starting off with some cards from the newest Mega Brave set. This is a Japanese set featuring Mega cards, of course. Here's a Mega Lucario EX in the heat of battle with a Venusaur, looks like, that sold for $74. And then here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Venusaur, or a Mega Venusaur EX that sold for $208.50. Here we have a Full Art Lily's Determination Special Art Rare that sold for $260. And then we saw both of the Gold Mega EX cards. Here's the Gold Mega Lucario EX that sold raw for $425. And then we saw two PSA 10 examples of this card come by, one for $835, the other one for $870. Here we have a Gardevoir EX Special Art Rare that sold as a PSA 10 for $280, and then the Gold Mega Gardevoir EX sold as a PSA 10 for $880 this week. Up next are a couple of Black Label cards from Crown Zenith. Here is a Black Label Entei V that sold for $1,831, and this Black Label Leafeon V-Star sold for $1,876. Here, folks, the Charmander Black Star promo from the Obsidian Flames Elite Trainer box is selling like crazy. Here's a sale of a PSA 10 for $335. And then we have the lineup here. It's the Charmander and then the Squirtle and Bulbasaur from Stellar Crown, all in PSA 10, sold for $690. Up next, we have a lot of what looks like 16 Magikarp art rares from Triple Beat. All PSA 10 sold for $2,175. Here we have two sales of the Umbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies. It's securely now a $3,000+ card. Here's a sale for an even $3K. Another one sold this week for $3,150. And then here is a BGS 10 Black Label Japanese Umbreon VMAX that sold for $10,600. We saw two sales of the Alt Art Latios GX from Team Up. This one here sold for $8,300. The other one sold for $8,500. Here we have a Shining Lugia that came down a little bit this week. So we're so used to seeing cards just hitting new record prices recently, but this one right here has come down in the past couple weeks, selling as a PSA 10 for $930. And the beginning of the month, this card was selling for $1,425. There was a few sales around this price point, so I'm not sure what's going on with the Lugia or the Shining Lugia, but it's come down quite a bit here. Getting into the XY era, we have this Charizard from the Generations Radiant Collection, sold as a PSA 10 for $910. And we saw this Mega Gardevoir EX from the Radiant Collection sell for $4,020. We have this Mega Rayquaza EX from Roaring Skies that sold as a PSA 10 for $2,075. And then here's another Rayquaza EX full art from Roaring Skies that sold for $5,600. From Ancient Origins, we have this Mega Sceptile EX that sold for $2,225. And then we saw a few Phantom Forces cards. All Gengar cards do exceptionally well once again. Here's a Mega Gengar EX. This is not the ultra rare version. Sold as a PSA 10 for $3,650, while the ultra rare version of this card sold for $7,115. And then we have this full art Gengar EX that sold for $11,600 this week. Getting into some vintage cards, we have this Black Label Vileplume from Jungle that sold for $2,031. Here we have a no symbol Flareon from Jungle, got a PSA 10 and sold for $1,700. Here is a CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Typhlosion number 18 from Neo Genesis, sold for $2,275. We saw a couple of the middle children in terms of evolutionary lineups. Here's a reverse holo Charmeleon from Legendary Collection, sold for $2,711, while this reverse holo Kadabra sold for $4,100. A couple of E-Series cards. We have this Skyridge Houndoom in PSA 10, sold for $4,938. And then we saw this Skyridge Gyarados Holo sell as a PSA 10 for $6,100. And in my humble opinion, this is one of the top 3 greatest Gyarados cards. You got this card, you got the Shining Gary, and you have the Gold Star Gary. Those 3 right there, I mean, perfection. Here we have the Gengar Holo from Expedition, sold as a PSA 10 for $10,100. Here's the Umbreon from Skyridge that sold for $15,360 this week. Here we have a CGC 10 Gem Mint Crystal Charizard that sold for $12,211, while a PSA 9 copy sold for $14,350. Getting into the EX era, we have this Groudon EX from Crystal Guardians, sold for $4,150. Here's a reverse holo Salamence from Delta Species, sold for $2,276. Here's a Gold Star Groudon from Delta Species, sold for $13,600 as a PSA 10, while this Gold Star Kyogre sold for $13,100. And then check this out, folks. I'm not sure how legit it is. I mean, you tell me. It's this raw copy of the Gold Star Charizard from EX Dragon Frontiers, pack fresh, supposedly, sold for $14,900. And if this is an authentic card, it does look very good. Taking a look at the front and back here, looks very clean. However, a raw copy selling for more than a PSA 9 copy, as a PSA 9 sold this week for $14,500. So man, if you're going to spend that kind of money on a raw copy of this card, you better hope it gets a 10. From Diamond and Pearl, we have this Holo Lugia from Secret Wonders, sold for $9,100. Here is a Venusaur Rumble card in PSA 10 that sold for $7,600 this week. A couple of Level X cards came by. Here's a Mismagius Level X from Rising Rivals, sold for $2,436. Here is the Charizard G Level X from Supreme Victors, sold for $10,100, and the Snorlax Level X from Rising Rivals sold for $15,000 this week. And then we also saw this Black Label Japanese Mewtwo Level X sell for $4,550. And then we saw a couple of bangers from Call of Legends. Here we have the PSA 10 Palkia, sold for $4,718. The Ho-Oh here sold for $10,100. And the Lugia sold for $23,676 big ones. And then from Heart Gold Soul Silver Triumphant is our one and only Prime card. It's Gengar here, sold as a PSA 10 for $6,400. And then on to some insane black and white era sales. Here's an Umbreon from Plasma Freeze that sold for $5,050. Here's a Crocodile from Dragons Exalted, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,025. Here's an Empoleon from Plasma Freeze that sold for $4,100. We saw 2 sales of this Latios EX from Plasma Freeze. One sold for $5,100. The other one sold for $4,950. Here we have the Palkia EX full art from Plasma Blast, sold as a PSA 10 for $7,300. Here's the Articuno EX from Plasma Storm, sold for $7,200. Here's the full art Dialga EX from Plasma Blast that sold for $11,100. And then here's the full art Groudon EX from Dark Explorers, sold for $12,100. And then lastly from the black and white era was this full art Giratina EX from Dragons Exalted that sold for $15,400. On to a couple of sealed booster box sales from my boy TCA Gaming. Here's a Fates Collide booster box that sold for $2,700. A Primal Clash box sold for $3,650. The Ancient Origins booster box sold for $8,175. We have a black and white Dragons Exalted box that sold for $13,889. Here is a black and white Next Destinies box that sold for $7,100. Here is a Diamond and Pearl base set booster box that sold for $7,901. And then folks, we have this case of Evolving Skies booster boxes that sold for a total of $16,100, along with this Evolutions booster box case that sold for $12,600. And then on to just a couple of cards from the Fanatics Collect Weekly auction block. Here's the Full Art Charizard EX from Flashfire that sold for $4,920. Here is a Crystal Nidoking that sold as a PSA 10 for $5,400. Here we have another Mega Gengar EX that sold for $7,800. And then we have this Japanese Crystal Charizard that sold for $18,000 this week. And the auction of the week, folks, despite seeing all of these 5-figure sales, I'm going to have to give to this Mew EX Special Illustration Rare. Why? Because it's nearly $2,000 as a PSA 10 now. Here's a sale for $1,888, another one for $1,925, up to $1,950. And folks, it wasn't 2 months ago this card was selling as a PSA 10 for only $690 in auction. And that is a 183% increase on this guy in just 2 months. This Mew EX card is becoming very iconic very quickly. Mew is really just an iconic Pokemon in general, especially this year. We've been seeing tons of insane Mew cards come by. What do you think, folks? Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it more than you know. Let me know what you thought about the recap in the comments. That's all I got. As usual, I will catch you in my next one.